Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of All Around Azure. My name is Jason Hand. Really excited to be here today again. I was on yesterday with Frank and had a lot of fun doing what we called our All Around Azure Unplugged, which was really just an opportunity to do a little bit more of a AMA, ask anything with our community, with those of you who join us each and every week on Twitch as well as on Learn TV. So that was really fun. Now we're going to get back to kind of our usual programming, and we're going to actually return back to a guest and a topic that we discussed, I want to say back in maybe August. I can't remember exactly, but it's serverless and functions. And to tell us more about that, let's just go ahead and introduce our guest. Say hello to none other than the code traveler himself, Brandon Minnick. How are you, Brandon?
Hey, Jason, I'm good. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time and actually, kind of being the person to introduce things back to. What's the right word when you're coming back from the vacation? When you kind of get back into your groove, and you're like, oh, okay, now I remember how to do my job again. You ever forget how to do your job when you're like taking a break for a week or so?
Yeah, but honestly, I'd say that's a sign of a good vacation. You should completely forget about work. That's the only way you can decompress and have a nice, relaxing vacation. So, if that's what's happened, kudos to you, man.
Yeah, it was nice. I forgot how to email when I got back, and how to log into some things. But I feel like I got my feet back under me now. So we're excited to. Ignite was what I came back to. It was another big part of it too. So as I was coming back into my Ignite, or as I was coming back into my mindset of work, Ignite was going on. That was always, that made things a lot more stressful, I guess, as you could say. And everybody else was stressed out and doing things. What kind of stuff were you doing during Ignite? Were you involved with that at all?
I wasn't too involved. The world I live in is mostly .NET, primarily Xamarin and mobile, and we didn't have too many big announcements at Ignite. And if anybody's listening, wondering what is Ignite? What are they talking about? It's we'll say one of the yearly Microsoft conferences. So there's Build, Inspire, Ignite, and don't quiz me on the differences between all of them, other than the time of year. But yeah, for my tooling, my community, my expertise, the .NET platforms, we in Xamarin, we had our big announcements back at Build, is where we announced the next version of .NET, which is .NET 6, and cool new frameworks like Maui, which is kind of the evolution of Xamarin Forms. If everybody's familiar with Xamarin Forms, it's evolving into Maui and .NET 6. So basically, we've been chugging away on building those, and so we didn't have too many announcements, but I did do a video pre-recorded that I have no idea if it was used, because Ignite is kind of one of these 24 hours a day conferences. It lasts for a couple days, but there's sessions going on all around the world at all times of day. And so I'm not sure if my video got played, but yeah, I did a video on, what did we do? Azure App Services and a little bit of Key Vault. But yeah, I don't know. I'll have to follow up with our colleague Laurent to see if and where it made it to the air.
Yeah, I feel like that was a common story for many of us on the cloud advocacy team, as we were all involved in lots of different ways, and some of it was creating content ahead of time that was used, sort of a video on demand. A lot of us in fact were moderators.
Yep.
So, and as far as the difference between Ignite and some of the others, I want to say, well, I don't know the size difference exactly, but the audience always feels a little bit maybe more towards the IT operations space, the IT ops folks. There's, of course, a lot of development stuff in there, because so much of it these days is what's the difference? Infrastructure as code or application as code, I don't know. It's the only one I've actually been to in person. I've never been to Build or any of the other big events that go on. Yeah. So
I'm the total opposite.
Oh, really? Yeah.
I've only been to Build.
Nice. Well, unfortunately, we can't meet in person to do that kind of stuff, but we can do these types of things where we get together and we brainstorm ideas on, what are you working on and what's interesting and what's, some things that you're hearing out there in the community about what people want to learn. And I know you're really plugged into the several different communities, the Xamarin one for sure, but also the Azure Functions and the serverless stuff, and I'm guessing also the .NET stuff as well. But what do you you've already been on this show before, and we went through serverless, to a certain degree, and created our very first serverless API. But at the end of that show, I kind of put the question out there as like, well, what would we do next? We've run out of time here. So what would be the next steps? And that kind of led us to where we are today. So maybe if you could, for just to give everybody a little bit of an overview of what we did last time, revisit what we kind of touched on serverless, some of the things we did with functions, and then maybe we can start talking about what do we do from here for the rest of the show today.
Yeah, no, that sounds awesome. So if anybody missed our previous episode, and I'm with Jason, I forget how many weeks ago it aired, because, I don't know, time's not real during the pandemic, and every day feels like the same, so it could have been 2 weeks, it could have been 2 months last time we hung out together. But yeah, we talked about serverless, and we're going to kind of pick up where we left off, but I think you're right, Jason, it's a good idea to start with just kind of that overview in case anybody is new to serverless, watching this for the first time. Like, what is it? What does it mean? And so probably the easiest way to think about serverless is just, it means less server. So it doesn't mean that there's no server. And actually, I should probably zoom out a little bit. We're talking about Azure. We're talking about the cloud and ways to run your code in the cloud. And historically, that's always meant that you could provision either a virtual machine or maybe virtualization of that, like a couple CPUs, a couple gigs of RAM to just be always allocated to you, always on, always running, whether or not it's being used or not. So it's great because you could easily get a server up and running, you can easily get a website up and running, but the downside is that you have to pay for it whether your users are actually going to that website. And so the advent of serverless came about because it's all consumption based or usage based. So it means that if nobody's coming to my website and I've built my website on serverless Azure functions, then when nobody's visiting my website, I'm not using any resources in Azure. So Azure will actually spin down all the resources to zero. So I have zero CPU usage, zero memory usage. And really what this means for me as a user is I don't have to pay for it. And so like we were just chatting about, I'm a mobile app developer by trade. So I make iOS and Android apps. I've got a couple in the App Store, and specifically I do that with Xamarin. But the way I kind of came to know and love serverless is all my apps are free. I've never made money off my mobile apps, and maybe that's not a good thing. Maybe it's something I should look into, but I just love to make apps. So all my apps are free to download. There's no in-app purchases. And what that means for me as the independent app developer, these are apps that I just make in my spare time on nights and weekends, that there's going to be server costs. How much are they? And when I built my first app, this was kind of pre-serverless. And yeah, so I needed a database. I needed some APIs for the app to interact with. And I did all that in what we call Azure App Services, which is a great tool. But what I found with my mobile app is the usage was very periodic. So heavy user base in the US, and then a sprinkling of other users around the world, primarily in English-speaking countries, because the app is all about puns. It's called Pun Day, and and so if it's hard to translate puns, so the first app I made is only in English because all of the puns are in English, and maybe they translate. If anybody out there is familiar with, say, how to translate English puns into German, feel free to hit me up on Twitter at the Code Traveler. We can chat. But yeah, so what I noticed was the usage was very periodic, and it was heavily used during daytime hours in the U.S. Not so much used outside of those hours. And serverless came about, and it kind of gave you this value proposition of, why are you paying for resources in the cloud when nobody's using them? And it's almost like, I was trying to think of a good analogy. If restaurants made you pay for your reservation, and I know like some restaurants will ask for a credit card when you make a reservation, and then if you cancel it within 24 hours, then they'll charge you whatever fee. It's when your stuff in the cloud is always on, you're reserving it and you have access to it whenever you need it and whenever you want it. But the downside is you're also paying for that reservation.
Yeah.
And so with serverless, it's the same idea. I still have my code running in the cloud, but everything spins down to zero when I'm not using it. And this was huge for me because, I've got a couple thousand monthly active users. And when I moved over to Azure Functions, to this day, I've yet to see a monthly bill from Azure that's above 10 cents. So 10 US pennies a month. Usually the bill is less than that. So like 8 cents, 7 cents. And that is something that I can afford. That's something I'll happily pay out of pocket for my free mobile app so that users can use it and enjoy it for free. And so, when we talk about serverless, that's really the big benefit to me, is that cost savings as somebody who makes apps in their spare time that doesn't have any income stream, doesn't have any revenue generated from this app. And it's something that I want to do because I enjoy it. But if my server costs were something like a couple $100 a month, then that's a more serious conversation. That's, let's sit down, my wife and myself, and let's look at our budget and see if this is something that's worth it. Yeah. But with serverless, I can afford a couple pennies a month.
Yeah, I mean,
happily.
I think that's one of the big things, right? Is like it now makes it so much easier to just experiment and create some stuff, and build stuff that might turn into something without this fear of having to deal with a huge bill or something at some point. But then the downside is that there is that startup time, right? Like there's that trade-off of how the serverless stuff goes. But before we go any further, I want to just say hello to a few people, first of all, in chat. Those of our friends who are joining us on Twitch. We've had the group over from the Visual Studio Twitch channel have rated us. So hello, friends. Thanks for joining the show here. Happy to have you. Definitely ask any questions that you might have for Brandon or myself. I'm watching the chat, so I'm going to relay those over to Brandon. In fact, there's already been a few questions. So if you don't mind, Brandon, before we switch gears and start doing some hands-on stuff, some of the questions that we've had. The first question was, is Azure Functions open source, or would we be tightly coupled with the Azure implementation?
Ooh, good question. The SDKs are open source. So for me as a .NET developer, I'll add some NuGet packages to my code, my library, and those SDKs are open source. I don't know if the actual, we'll say, implementation infrastructure code for Azure Functions is. So I don't think they are, unless you know differently, Jason.
I don't think so. Yeah, I'm not totally sure, but I think
so. We'll say probably no to the implementation code. So like what's actually running in Azure, all the code that we don't have to worry about. But the SDKs are open source. So, and you also don't need to use the SDKs. They're just, I highly recommend it because it'll save you tons of code. But if the actual, in terms of being locked in, so this is something that is a good question, because you'll see today that one of the other cool things with serverless is because they only run when we need them to run, that means they have to be triggered somehow. And so in our last episode, we made what's known as an HTTP trigger, which for all intents and purposes, it's just an API. It's HTTP trigger, API, same thing, just serverless terminology. And so what that means is when I make the API call, it's that HTTP trigger that wakes up my serverless app that runs my code. And we'll see today, we're going to explore a bunch of other triggers like storage triggers and database triggers and queue triggers. And these are all things that's like if a new row is added to my database, it can trigger this serverless function. So we can do some database verification. I use these for cleanup, just make sure my data didn't get corrupted. Because especially when you're dealing with mobile, if the user started writing to the database and maybe like went through a tunnel, then we have the potential to maybe have bad data. But so with these triggers, there's a lot of logic called bindings, and those are going to be tightly coupled to Azure, because Azure needs to know, or specifically Azure Functions needs to know, okay, how do I wake up? What am I listening for? And we'll see these more as we explore today. But the code we write is just C# .NET code. And so once that function is triggered and our code's running, all that code is just me. So I can have it do whatever I want. We've got, literally whatever you want. And so my recommendation would be is you can just have your file for your triggers, and then your code is stored in separate files. Like I kind of think of that as like the service layer of my app. And so, if I wanted to maybe move that from Azure Functions to something that's on all the time, like Azure App Service, then I can just point that app service code to the existing code. And with functions, it's really just about our triggers and our outputs. So what's cool with Azure Functions, they can also do stuff for you. So you can have like a database output, which means just whenever this is done running, write this line of code to the database automatically, and you don't actually have to make that database connection and do all that crazy stuff. But so I wouldn't say you're locked in. You just have to keep that in mind. Like if we're using the SDK, those SDK specific things are going to be there, but it's not a whole lot of, and probably almost negligible a couple steps to just make sure your code's in either a separate file or a separate layer. But good question. That's always important to keep that stuff in mind, because if you want to move past Azure Functions one day and onto something else, or maybe you want to run that code locally, then always good things to keep in mind.
I haven't actually had any hands-on experience with Lambda, with AWS Lambda, but I would have to imagine your code's going to work fine in both, right? You do some C# code or whatever it is you're writing in.
Yeah, I mean, .NET's .NET, so you'll just have to tweak the things. And same, I haven't done much with Lambda, but I assume they'll have their own version of triggers and bindings and probably their own SDK. But
hey, that reminds me. Have you ever used an event from within, I don't know, within Azure as what kicks off one of your functions? You know how you can set up like an event, like it can be a monitoring event, it could be all kinds of things.
I mean, I'm not sure if you're talking about specifically, because there's things like Event Hub in Azure. I haven't used Event Hub, but I mean, I've had events trigger. So like, for example, if you consider like you can create a timer trigger, so it always runs at the same time every day, or maybe it always runs every 5 minutes. And so if you consider that an event, totally. Or like these database triggers, I have those for my apps in the App Store, just to make sure my database doesn't get corrupted. And so events like this, events like those, yes. But if we're talking about like Event Hub,
no, I don't think I've messed with Event Hub too much. I'm thinking more of like when something gets written into cloud storage, like a blob storage, you can set an event that says anytime something's been written here, fire an event. And I haven't tried to go down that path towards like, well, what am I going to trigger? But it seems like an Azure function would be easily one of those things.
That's exactly right. And that's on the plan for today. So hopefully we'll have that working by the end of the stream. If
Nice.
not, we'll struggle through it and see if we can figure it out together.
Cool. Well, I think we've got all the questions so far mostly answered. We've got some other good comments in here, but with respect of time, do you want to, what do you want to do next? Do you want to switch over and start showing us some things, or
Sure.
what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess speaking of time, remind me again, it's 11:21 where I am.
Yeah, we still have about
how
an
much time we
hour. Yeah, so we got like 70 minutes.
Okay, so at
We're
the
only about-
bottom of the following hour. No
Yep.
problem. Yeah, I will. Yeah, let's go ahead and share my screen.
All right, let's get to going.
I'll move Skype out of the way so we don't get that Skypeception going on. And yeah, man, we'll start.
And also, I will say
Right.
thank you to everybody who pointed out there was a little bit of an echo. I figured out what the deal was. I switched to a new camera, and the audio, I guess, was coming through the camera as well as my microphone. So hopefully that's sorted out. But let me know in chat if there's any more audio issues. But thanks for the heads up.
That'll do it, man. The first time I used OBS, so we're using a platform in the background called OBS that helps you kind of aggregate streams, and that's how Jason's able to put my face and my desktop and his face all on the same screen at the same time.
Yeah,
And
except for that, right at the moment your screen is actually frozen on your camera.
Oh, wait, my camera's frozen, or well, that's a bummer. I didn't change anything, but can you see my screen? Because that'll be the important thing. I mean, if you can't see my face, then
I'll tell you what, we'll go to the screen here. And yeah, we'll deal with that another time. But you're a little frozen, but your screen is working just fine, so I think we're good.
all right. See me moving this Visual
Yep.
Studio for Mac window around. Great.
Yep,
Yeah.
you got it.
So apologies to everybody who wants to see my shining, smiling face, or maybe that's a good
It
thing.
will. You're just frozen.
Oh no! Hopefully it's not in some embarrassing pose.
No, I think it was
But-
when you moved the Skype thing out of the way, so it might have something to do with the NDI on that. That's all right, though. We got you.
That's all good. So, yeah. So why don't we just start by kind of the same way we started last time, just by creating a Azure Functions resource. So Azure, if you're new to Azure, Azure calls everything a resource. And so if you're creating a new database, then that's a resource in Azure. If you're creating a new website, that's a resource in Azure. We'll be creating serverless functions. That's a resource. So I just like to call that out because that was something confusing to me, because I was like, well, I don't need a resource. I just need a function. But everything in Azure is called a resource. So we'll go ahead and search for functions. And there we go. And let's get this created, because once we create this serverless app, then we'll be able to write some code and push code to it. So we'll also have to create a resource group. So again, everything in Azure is a resource, and a resource group is just a folder. So it's let's call this functions. Last time was 101, so maybe today's 201. And that same name to our function app. Okay, cool. And hopefully we can see this green check mark here. This green check mark means that nobody's used this name before. And that's important because the function name is the URL. So if I chose something common, like I'm sure somebody's used temp. We're all developers, right? There we go. It'll say that name's not available because temp.azurewebsites.net is how you'll be accessing that serverless function later. So
Right. It's got a
Functions 201.
publicly accessible address.
right. And we'll be using .NET today. And then you can also choose different regions. Regions are just data centers. So Azure has, I don't know how many dozens of data centers around the world, but data centers are all around the world. So if your users, well, let's say my recommendation is put this closest to your users. So if your users are in India, South India, great. If your users are in the UK, choose the UK data centers.
Mm-hmm.
But we can keep this central US for today.
Hey, that just reminded me, looking at the screen there, Brandon. Someone had asked us in the questions earlier if .NET 5 is available.
Ooh, good question. Not yet. So technically, .NET 5 is, we'll say, still in preview. We just pushed out a .NET 5 release candidate. Oh, again, time's weird, but I think that was last week. So there are opportunities to use .NET 5, but yeah, right now, Azure Functions doesn't have the .NET 5 support, but that'll all roll out eventually. I know I'm eager to get .NET 5 running in Azure Functions too, because of all the goodies that are coming to it, but I gotta hold back for just a little longer, which I'm bummed about too.
By the way, it was July when we first chatted, July 26th. I looked it up.
Was it really? Oh my gosh.
In fact, I know, that was like ancient times, it feels like. But I put the link into the chat for everybody if you want to go back and watch that episode another time.
Right on. All right, so let's go ahead and get this created. And there we go. So when I click the create button, Azure's basically just allocating resources. So in that, I think I picked the central US data center. It's just kind of carving out some storage space for me there. And it should only take a couple seconds. But I'll tell you what, while that's deploying, we can jump into some code. Oh, it's already finishing up. So I'm in Visual Studio, specifically Visual Studio for Mac today. And you can do Azure Functions. You can write code for your Azure Functions in, we'll say all sorts of languages. We're doing everything in C# today because that's the language I know and love. But if you are more familiar with Java or JavaScript or Python, you can create serverless functions in those languages as well. But specifically, we'll be in Visual Studio today. You could also use Visual Studio Code. You could do everything from the command line and use you can use Notepad to write your code and then push it to Azure via command line. But this is just easier for me. I don't like to memorize too many command line codes if I don't have to. But anyways, we're going to create a new project and we're going to go into Cloud here on the left and select Azure Functions. I think in Visual Studio on the PC, there's a nice little search bar where you can just search all the different new project templates. So if you just search for functions, you'll land on it. And then once we do that, should have updated this ahead of time. Oh, nice and fast. Oh, Jason, I just got gigabit fiber.
I'm so jealous.
And it is amazing. Of course, I need to restart Visual Studio now. But
hey, while you're doing that, let's just out of an experiment. Will you bring that video, that Skype little sidecar screen back into view? I wonder if that might wake up your camera. You know how you like minimized or moved the video? I think you said
that.
Yeah. So okay. So yeah, I can see that. That's.
Put that down here so it doesn't. Wow, no.
I'm everywhere. Well, that didn't do anything. That's okay. That was worth a shot.
Keep it down there. Dang.
Everybody can we should make a meme of the different things we can do with Brandon's pose right now.
With my face.
Where's Chloe? She's good at this.
All right. So now that we updated those templates, we'll come back in here. All right. So what we were chatting about the top of the show was all these different triggers. Because again, with Azure Functions, with Serverless, your code is not running. And you can almost think of it like when I push my code to Azure or push my code to Azure Functions, Azure just kind of stores my code in a file or in a folder. So the code is sitting there. It's ready to run, but it's not running, which is, again, how we get that benefit of only having to pay, saving money, we'll say. And so, with any serverless function, the question is, how are we going to wake it up? And on the last show, like Jason said, he'll drop the link in the chat. So definitely go back and check it out because we covered HTTP triggers. But if you're familiar with an API, that's all that is. We just have this concept of triggers because we have to know how we're going to wake up and run our code. So HTTP trigger, that's a GET request, a POST, a PUT, a delete, whatever you want. It's just an API. But what we're going to do today is dive a little deeper, and we're going to kind of go through this list, and we'll see how far we get. There's a lot of fun ones in here, but yeah, why don't we start with, let's start with a timer trigger. That'll kind of ease us into it. And then Jason, since you mentioned blob triggers, we'll dive into blob triggers. We'll see if we can get that working. And so, let's start out with a timer trigger. So we'll call this functions 201. Actually, we'll just call it timer trigger.
Hey, the question came up in chat if choosing between different languages affects the cost of your functions.
Oh, I have no idea. I've never thought about that because I definitely live in a .NET bubble. But
I'm pretty sure it's just a matter of consumption. So language does not necessarily matter. But if I would guess if the language dictates length of time that something processes or runs, then yes.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. Because at the end of the day, it's just code running, and I mean, really, these functions are essentially just a method or a literal function that's running. So these should actually, really good point to talk about. These should not be long running functions. And to that point, Azure Functions will cut off your code if it runs too long. So when we're thinking about this serverless architecture, it's really important to keep that microservice mindset. And so think about if I was writing one of my mobile apps, I might have a function that runs when a user clicks a button. So that user clicks the button, it kicks off a method in my code. That method is kind of how I think of these serverless functions. So it should only just do one thing. It should do it, we'll say, relatively quickly, get in, get out. Because if you hit that time limit, and I'm not sure if you remember the exact time limit, Jason. I forget if it's 5 or 10 or 15 minutes.
No, I think it's 5. But
5 minutes. All right.
Pretty sure.
So if your function runs longer than 5 minutes, Azure will actually just terminate it. And if you have a job that runs for longer than 5 minutes, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It's
10 minutes.
10 minutes. All right. So 10 minutes, even longer. But yeah, if you have something that needs to run for longer than 10 minutes, like maybe, where have I hit this? I've hit this where I pull every record from the database and just go through it and verifying data and everything. So like something's in my database and I want to make sure that is tied to a valid user account, and just kind of running a check like that where I'm, again, just cleaning the database, but I have to comb through every record. Yeah, sometimes that takes longer than 10 minutes. And if it does, that's okay. But maybe we don't use serverless for it. We use maybe an app service or heck, for me, if it took longer than 10 minutes, I just put it on a timer trigger. This is my little workaround hack. I used a timer trigger. And so instead of running it once a day where I was hitting that 10-minute timeout, I just ran it twice a day or once an hour. Yeah. And so just by switching how often that function runs, I was able to shrink down the time, because in an hour, there's only so many new database entries that I need to check. Whereas if I waited till the end of the day, then I'll have to comb through all the new ones for that day. So yeah, there's little tricks like that, but keep these in mind. Like we're talking microservices. We're talking just one function that does one thing. You don't want this to run for too long, and you can't run it for too long. So good point.
Yeah. Okay, we'll let you get back to your timer trigger. It looks like you're building a cron job here.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you that, if you're familiar with cron jobs.
Oh yeah, cron tabs. Everybody.
Yeah, so that's literally all this is. And for somebody that has no idea what we're talking about, let's check out cron job. So cron is short for chronological, and this is I have no idea what's going to be in this article, but okay, actually that's exactly what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
Perfect.
So yeah, cron is short for chronological. Chronological is just long for time. It's just a fancy way to say things happening in time. And what a cron job allows us to do, well, specifically, this was something that I learned back on Linux back in the day when I had a Linux server in my database that I wanted to run a job once an hour.
Yeah.
So with cron and cron jobs, they have this kind of weird syntax where it's a number space, or in this case, they're using asterisks. Asterisks are just wildcards. But what it allows us to do is specify what minute, what hour, what day of the month, what day of the week we want this code to run.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, man, that's exactly what we're doing with our Azure function here.
Yeah.
Oops.
And honestly, it feels like it's not all that different than how I learned of cron tab and creating cron jobs and all that stuff was back in the day when I was just using bash scripts to do backups and to do simple, kind of file management and cleanup. And it was just, basic cron jobs that would kick off, at various times of the night usually. And it's kind of fun to, see that stuff still being used, especially amongst more of like the developer community. Cause I'm more from an ops background. But to see the intersection of these things is fun.
Yeah, right. Like everything's coming full circle. So it is, I will say, if you've never seen this cron job format, like we kind of have this peak right here in the browser behind, it is a little weird at first, but if you, and this is kind of what I do. Let's see, cron job daily at midnight. Usually somebody's created. There you go. So if you want to run a cron job that runs daily at midnight, Google it. I'm sure somebody's already put that together to help you out. But this is kind of the syntax. And so what this means is on the 0th minute of the 0th hour, so 12 a.m. And then the rest is asterisk because the day of the month. So we want to run it every day. We want to run it every month. Mm-hmm. And we want to run it on every day of the week. So the 0th minute of the 0th hour, every day, every month, every day of the week. This is our cron job for for every day at 12 a.m. So yeah, it's a little weird. And I mean, I still struggle with this because there's also flavors. Like certain flavors of Linux will look at it differently. And I think we're even guilty of that in Azure where we include seconds. So it's tiny on my screen there, but this info button tells us that the first value is actually the second, then the minute, then the hour, then the day, then the month, then the day of the week. So I always cheat and look it up anytime I need to figure this out. But let's spin one up.
Okay.
So I'll tell you what, let's just go with that syntax. So we want the 0th second of the 0th minute of the 0th hour. Is 0th even a word? It is now.
Yeah, I think we just invented a word here on All Around Azure.
All right, so 0 second, 0 minute, 0 hour, star day, star month, star day of the week. So every day at midnight, this timer trigger will run. And let's see what this looks like. All right. Let's make this a little bit bigger.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem. And push that to the side. Boom. So this is what the template gives us. And circling back to that question we had earlier about how locked in are we? If we write all this code for Azure Functions, do we have to use Azure Functions for the rest of our life? So the answer to that was there's only a little bit of code that are function specific. So there's a couple of things in here like function name, timer trigger, timer info, iLogger. That's actually more of a C#.NET thing. That's not really function specific, but these 2 lines of code, this is what's specific to our Azure Functions. All the code we put in here, so this log information, whatever we want to do is not. And so one way to maintain that, we'll say scalability, maintainability, is we could just put this code for that we're going to run inside of a separate file, and we could just call that file here. So we could keep the code that runs separate from the function specific code, and then we're off to the races. So it's not too bad at all. But yeah, let's take a look at what we're looking here, because it's not a lot of code, but specifically this timer trigger. So this is what tells Azure Functions how and when to run. We were talking about timer triggers, and look, that's our cron job again here. So using Visual Studio, like I mentioned at the top of the hour, I prefer it because the templates kind of guide me into this, and I didn't have to memorize how to write a cron job, and it gave me the syntax. Whereas if this just showed up, I'd be like, I don't know, is this days? Is this hour? Seconds? But so yeah, what we have here is a timer trigger. It'll wake up at midnight every single day, and we would add our code here to run it. But let's, for the sake of this demo, let's see if we just push this to Azure. Gotta log in. Go. Yes, I love that it does this.
I know, this is great. New change to our two-factor.
Oh my gosh, it's so much nicer than having to enter your password, and IT makes you rotate your passwords every so often. And so instead, it's like, hey, we sent you a push notification with a number on it. Verify that number. I go, no problem.
Yeah. I feel like that just happened recently, those changes.
I think you're right. I mean, that's when I noticed it. And
in fact, it's like when because I think when I came back from my break is when I realized I had to like log back into a bunch of stuff, and things were different, and it was easier.
Everything timed out.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, so actually, let me walk through, well, because I'll have to load again. But yeah, I just told Visual Studio that I want to publish this to Azure. So of course I had to log in first because it has to know what services I have already spun up in Azure. But here's our functions 201. And when I click publish, it automatically builds my code and will start deploying it to Azure. So in just a couple seconds, there you go. See, it's publishing to Azure. It's doing a bunch of stuff that who knows what it's doing back there, but eventually, because we have this resource already built in Azure and we're publishing to it, we'll see our new function show up here. So right now, let's see. Oh, how quick. Oh, that was super quick.
Nice.
So our timer trigger is already there. So just a couple seconds to push it. And with this timer trigger, we configured it to run every day at midnight. And so, I love being on the stream. I love hanging out with you, Jason, but I'm not going to wait till midnight to watch this run.
You could actually, we wouldn't even know because you're frozen. You could just pretend that you're here. Just put like a recorded version of yourself on audio.
Like, yeah, he's really committed to the cause. He's just
how does he stay like that for so long?
So what we can do, we can do a couple things. So I want to just show you. We can kick these off manually, and let's see. Let's try and get this screen space maximized. There we go. So what did we do in our code? So our code just will log an output to the screen that says C# timer trigger function executed at datetime.now. And I assume that's probably datetime.now of the server. And important point to bring up.
Oh yeah, how does it handle
that? Yeah, when we schedule these cron jobs, UTC.
Okay, I was gonna say whose midnight are we going off of?
Yeah, and actually, let's confirm that right now because we can run this manually. So anytime I've pushed functions to Azure, I always come to the Azure portal and run it because who knows what's different, right? Like maybe, so even that like datetime.now, that's going to look different on my local computer than on the server because different time zones.
Right.
And so little things like that have tripped me up in the past, where maybe I'm connecting to a database and I forgot to add my database connection string, or maybe I had localhost hard-coded somewhere in there and never changed it to the actual website. But anyways, yeah, we can just click test/run, and we could pass in parameters if we want. In this case, there's nothing to really pass in. And we should see our log show us that. And let's move that out of the way because it was successful. Awesome. But yeah, our timer triggered, and we get a couple things. So it'll always say executing and then the name of the function. And then when it's done, it'll always say executed and the name of the function. And also it'll let you know how long it ran, which is nice because you can always come back and look at the logs to see, like, especially if something fails.
Totally. Or even as about to fail. If this stuff is being logged, you could set up some collection to, then analyze that stuff. And if that duration gets to a number you're not comfortable with, might go look.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah. So yeah, if you see that function running
Very cool.
a little too long, it's getting close to that 10-minute timeout. You can see that there. But yeah, we can even, and so then here is we'll say the code we wrote. It was all from the template, but that the C# timer triggered, successfully executed, and look at that timestamp. That's UTC, right?
It looks correct, but yeah, I'm not sure. Hey, the question came up: is that speed at 114 milliseconds? Is that a cold start speed, or do we already have?
Oh yeah, let's talk about cold start for a minute, because this is a super important concept when we talk about serverless, because we touched on all the benefits, and we're going to keep talking about all the amazing things, and they really are amazing, because you get all this stuff basically not running for free in the cloud, but I mentioned earlier, I've got a couple thousand monthly active users, and my bill's never gone above 10 cents, let alone even a dollar. So for me, that's free. And by the way, yeah, that's totally UTC time.
Yeah, just taking a look at that.
Nailed it. Awesome. But yeah, when it comes to the trade-off, right? Because you're not going to get a super cheap bill in Azure without some sort of trade-off. And the trade-off is what we call this cold start time. And what that means is our code is not running. So it's serverless. That means if nobody's using our code, if nobody's calling our API, if this cron job or timer trigger is not running, then we are consuming 0 Azure resources, which means we don't have to pay for any Azure resources during that time. So this consumption-based model allows us to, we'll say, minimize our bill, but it does come at the cost of what's called this cold start. And cold start means that there is some overhead from our code not running, being triggered, and then our code running.
Yeah.
So what I've seen, and to be honest, this is actually one of the biggest focuses of the functions team, is to lower this cold start time. And every iteration they've done on Azure Functions, so I think we're on version 3 now, has always lowered the cold start time. But in my experience, when I use this in my mobile apps, I will see anywhere from half a second to 1.5 seconds of cold start time. And that's something to keep in mind, and just ask yourself, how much will that impact my users? And so I cheat a little bit in my mobile apps, because I add in some. So for example, if you launch the app, you'll see a little splash screen animation, and that's that's literally there to distract you, because what the app is doing is calling a serverless function, and in case that function is not already up and running. Oh, I should also mention there's the thing called warm start, and these functions will stay alive for a little bit of time on either end. So when my code's done running here, like if I call it and run it again, it's likely that this function, the resources are still allocated, and we'll get a warm start. Yeah, it executed right away. And oh no, I didn't mean to exit out of those logs, because I was just about to show you something of those logs.
Hey, by the way, while you're talking about the cold start, I just dropped a link into chat that goes into a lot more detail about the cold start. understanding all that stuff. And but yeah, it's definitely something you're gonna consider. But
Yeah, and so yeah, the functions will stay alive for a little bit of time after our code's done running, and then so if I have, let's say Jason launches my app, he's the first one to launch it in a while. So cold start, it'll take him about a second to get the data back from the API, and then I'm sitting next to him and I launch the app right after he does. Well, it'll only take a couple milliseconds for me to get that data back from the same API because it's already warmed up. So that's a warm start versus a cold start. But the cold starts are getting down to the point where it's almost becoming negligible. And like I said, I do some things in my app to just, we'll say, distract the user. So I put some fun animations, and usually you don't even notice it if it was a cold start or a warm start. And once we get lower and lower, like getting below a second, that's going to be just really opening up the doors, because there's a couple use cases I can think of where cold start is, we'll just say, detrimental to the business. And those situations, I think of like online stores like Amazon.com, Walmart.com. They have metrics around how much time is worth on their site. So like if a user, or a better way to put that is, if the site goes down, Amazon knows that they lost this like $100 million because the site went down for 5 seconds. Mm-hmm. So they've got that dialed in, so they know that, I mean, time is money, but they literally have it figured out and can measure exactly how much money that time is. Right. And so, yeah, I wouldn't recommend this cold start stuff for services like that, where like you need this done quickly, or maybe there's some real-time updates you need to give to the user and you can't risk a second delay.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier, is that especially in a serverless world, the idea that the underlying infrastructure might have some kind of a problem that could affect our application is now abstracted away. Like, we don't have a server to go watch the CPU performance or any of those like traditional metrics around, how is the health of our app and our infrastructure it runs on. So now we look at things more closely to the experience of the user, and when they're trying to use our service, or it's part of a sequence of services that get kicked off to, allow a user to do something, how long did that take, and what was that experience like? And so it's stuff like that becomes a little bit more important, especially for the more mature companies like the ones you were just mentioning of, who they understand the impact of, even a 5-minute outage. And even down to if there's, a 20-second delay in logging in, like what the bounce rate is on that. So it's great that all that stuff is available, and people are starting to realize you got to pay attention to that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you touched on a point that we hadn't mentioned yet, and that's also, I guess you would call it scalability. So Jason mentioned that with serverless, pretty much the reason, there's probably 2 reasons why the word serverless is used. So the first one being that your code isn't running on a server 24/7. Obviously, the code will run on a server when it's triggered, when it's woken up, and then it spins it back down to nothing. So that's where we get the awesome cost benefits from. Mm-hmm. But also that we don't have to worry about that server at all. So we don't have to worry about what operating system is it? Do we have the latest Windows updates, the latest security patches, and then all the other security issues that come along with having a publicly exposed IP, worry about things like denial of service attacks. That's all handled for us by Azure, Microsoft. What's the number now? I think it's $10 billion a year. Microsoft spends $10 billion a year just on Azure security. Oh, it's something ridiculous. It's something that I will never try to build a better security tool than these cloud services. So, but yeah, so when it comes to scaling, your serverless apps also auto scale automatically. So I mentioned I use serverless for my APIs that my mobile app connects to. Well, me and Jason running the same app on our running our phones, using the same app on our phones, will hit the same APIs. And so what happens if all 1,000 of my users hit the API at the same time? Well, we'll say in the old world, that would overload your server, and then it would take a long time for those responses to come back from the API. But in the serverless world, it'll automatically scale up. So it's all built in. We don't have to worry about it. But as soon as my serverless function detects that there's a heavy load, it'll just create and essentially consume more resources. So it'll spin up some more CPUs, some more RAM to handle that extra load, offload it on a different server maybe.
There's probably some load balancing that takes place.
Yeah, but I'm only speaking to this on a high level because I have no idea how it works, because it's just automatic. And I love that as we'll say a client-side mobile developer, where balancing server loads isn't necessarily my forte. Now I don't have to worry about it. And so that's another huge benefit of serverless, is you just never have to worry about that server.
The comment came up in chat that this might create a larger attack surface than like just a regular average web service. You have any thoughts about that?
So only a little, because I'm not a security expert, but I assume we're talking about like more people can DDoS it because it'll scale up. But I personally don't worry about it, because like Microsoft has all the security tooling in place. So it'll detect things like those denial of service attacks or some sort of intrusion, and I trust them because they know more about it than I do.
Right, and I would think, I'm like you. I don't know the ins and outs of all the stuff, behind the scenes, but I would imagine, like on serverless, like there's only certain ports that are open to the actual machines themselves, and all of the things we have in place, the standard security things we have in place, are pretty good, as you were mentioning how much we invest in that kind of stuff. So I think it's one of those what's the term, economies of scale. Like Microsoft puts so much into what they're doing to protect our own services and build out these data centers and all this nice tech, that we get to the point where we can actually pass on those benefits to the others, and that's how we end up with things like serverless.
Yeah, and I keep saying this, and I hope it stays true, but you never hear about Azure getting hacked. Like when you hear about these hacks or database leaks, anytime they happen, it's always like a company. It's like, I remember Target had a database get hacked and they lost some credit card information. This was years ago, but when you hear about it in the news, it's always a specific company. It's never Azure got hacked today, or even to promote the good job of the other security of the other clouds. But same with, you never hear about like AWS getting hacked or Google Cloud getting hacked. It's always like, I left a back door open, like I forgot to change the password on my SQL database. Like it's always something specific to the user or the company. But until, and hopefully it never happens, but that's what gives me a lot of solace in just trusting the security folks here at Microsoft.
They take it all very seriously. That reminds me, I got to finish I've got some mandatory security training I got to finish here before the end of the month.
Yeah. Oh man, those are good videos too.
Yeah, they're fun. Hey, just a quick time check. We got about 30 minutes left in the show.
Yes.
So I don't know. We have some more things that we want to cover. So I don't want to hold you up any longer.
Yeah, and let's keep rolling. So that was my timer trigger. We talked about cold starts. We talked about scaling up automatically. Beautiful. But let's try making another trigger. And let's see. Let's add a function. And let's do a blob trigger for this. So we called the other one timer trigger. So this one, blob trigger. So I guess first of all, what is a blob? In Azure, we have this thing called blob storage. And let's show. There we go. So we have this storage account. So what we're looking at here, this is all the, we'll say, the Azure stuff that got created. And maybe we'll make this a little bigger too. Boop. So this is all the Azure stuff that got created. I forgot.
No, you're good. We can see all the way down to the bottom. Now you can take it back to where it was.
Awesome. Beautiful. All right. So yeah, down here at the bottom, this is all the stuff that got created when I told Azure to create a resource, specifically an Azure Functions resource. So what it created was, this is our Functions app. This is where we're publishing our code to. This is what handles all the triggers and all that fun stuff. But there's also other things like application insights. This is what will handle the logging and the monitoring. This app service plan. This is, well, we created as consumption based. And actually, this is the good point that I forgot to bring up earlier when we were talking about cold starts. You can actually have, you can increase your plan to have certain things reserved. So if you do want to reserve 2 CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM, you can bump up your app service plan to do that. But keep in mind, now you're going to have to pay for that reservation. So your bill's going to go up a little bit too.
Yeah.
But the other thing it created automatically for us, and we can see it because it's called itself Azure Storage Account Funct B13F. So obviously I didn't name that. I'm bad at naming, but I'm not that bad. And this storage account is just basically a folder in the cloud. And so if I click into it, there's a couple things in here. And, I like to think of these as just folders on my desktop. And literally the reason this storage account was created is because when we publish our code to Azure, it has to live in a folder somewhere. So when we publish that code to Azure for our serverless functions, it lives in the storage account. Our function app is always listening, and that's what will trigger to wake up and run. And when it does that, it's actually pulling the code out of this storage account, but just a folder to hold things. Mm-hmm. And so inside here, we can have containers. Now, this probably isn't a great word to use because most people, when they hear containers, probably think Docker, Kubernetes, and rightfully so. I do too. But these are storage containers. So really what this is like, we can create folders here. And so things like these Azure Web Jobs, this was auto-created for us. So all these folders inside of here are where it holds our Azure Function stuff. But why don't we do this? We'll create a folder in here, and let's call it and they got rules. Everything's got to be lowercase, which I don't understand why, but somebody smarter than me does. And
it's me every time too. I forget. I'm definitely a camel case type of person.
Yeah, same, right? It's strange that certain things on Azure can use capital letters and numbers and certain things can't, but
I just struggle to read things if they don't, if it's all one word. I mispronounce it if it's,
yeah,
words get run together.
So we'll create this folder, and this is where we can upload anything. So like if I spin up Visual Studio Code just as a text editor, had some of those old error messages. Oh no, beach ball.
We still got 26 minutes left. We're good.
Plenty of time. So yeah, we'll just save this to the desktop as, we'll just say file1.txt, and this is just a text file. So I just wanted something that I could upload to this storage container, because at the end of the day, that's all it is. This is, there we go. So this is just a folder where we can upload any file we want to the cloud. Like I'm uploading a text file right now. I personally use these a lot in my apps to store images, videos, and basically just, think of it like a folder on your desktop where maybe you just had a vacation in Hawaii and you saved all your Hawaii photos in that Hawaii folder on your desktop. That's all we're talking about here. It's just
Yeah.
now we're in the cloud.
I found that I've started using it a lot because I've been trying to really like trim down some of my repos. You know, they just get a little bit too bloated, especially like web related ones that just have a lot of images in there. And so
Yeah.
I've put all my images into blob storage and then just reference those from within the file. So yeah, that's like for me been the biggest saver is like, well, where am I going to put all these images? You know, they're not personal images. They're just images of other things, and you can put them in GitHub. But if you're using Azure Static Web Apps, there's a limitation on how big the build can be when it goes to build like your HTML.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay,
and I'm sure this happens in lots of other places too. But so when I ran into that, I was like, well, where am I going to put all these images for the websites? Blob storage, create a container, upload the file just like you showed. Piece of cake.
Done. Yeah, and you can set your access level. So like right now this is private. What that means is like if I click on this file, there's a URL.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I launch Edge again in say in private mode and I navigate to that URL, I'm gonna get yelled at. It's because I don't have permission to do anything with it.
Yeah.
But let's see if we do this on the fly, I could open this up to say anybody can read and write.
Don't
Nothing
do it.
dangerous about doing that on a live stream, right?
We got any trollers in the audience?
And let's see if that, there it is. So now there's that hello world file. So
Right.
let me drop that back down. Just since we're streaming live around
Trust
the world.
but
That's probably
verify.
smart. So yeah, the nice thing about that is you can set up all those permissions. So if you wanted to use it within, like if you want to store files that only you have the access to, or maybe only your apps have the access to, you can lock it down as much as you want, or you can open it up as much as you want. So that, oh man, I lost my place. Oh, look at all these blades.
Look at all those blades.
I've never gotten used to the blades. Like I know they're there, but
Yeah.
I like that we have this kind of navigation here at the top now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that, my friends, is Azure Storage, and specifically Blob Storage. Blob. Oh shoot, it's an acronym. I forget what it stands for.
Let me look it up.
A blob is just a file of any type. So blob could be a text file, it could be an image, it could be a database file, like.
It's like binary object, binary large object something.
Ooh, yeah, that sounds really close. So,
where is the word?
all right, so bringing this all the way back to Azure Functions while Jason's looking up definitions. This blob trigger will wake up and run code anytime we've added something to our blob storage. And what's really cool here is we just have to pass in a couple parameters. So what it's going to ask me for is the blob path. And specifically what that means is what is the folder that we have in blob storage. So what did I name that folder? I called it storage trigger container, all lowercase, of course. So if I grab that, I put that folder name here, and then, oh, you know what I just noticed? We should have used hyphens to separate those words. Doesn't matter. Storage trigger container, all one word. So yeah, what's cool here is that we can do things like, you see how name here is in a curly bracket? So it's like open curly bracket, name, close curly bracket. Well, I also have a string name here. And what's going on, and if anybody's done ASP.NET stuff, this will feel really familiar. If you haven't, what's happening is whatever we set this name to in our blob trigger, so I could call this hello Jason. Well, that is going to be matched here. So whatever this variable is named, as long as this matches,
Okay.
this will automatically pass the string name in there. Now, hello Jason doesn't make a lot of sense, so let's pass that back to just the name of the blob. So in our example we just did a second ago, let's see if we can get these together, maybe just barely. Cool. So that file was called file1.txt. So the name that gets passed into my serverless function will be file1.txt. And we can do all sorts of things here with the blob trigger, because maybe we don't want to only trigger on this specific folder. Well, we could leave that as a wildcard, or maybe we do only want to trigger when the name says something like, or maybe the file name, the file name specifically needs to be .text. So we can add in extra constraints here to make it as specific as we want or generic as we want. But right, so what we're looking at now is this is a block of code that will run anytime I add something to this folder. I think the only other thing I didn't touch on is this connection. So Azure Functions need to know which storage account you're using so that it can connect to it.
Yeah.
But one benefit of what we just did is that, and hopefully this is still true because we'll find out soon enough, is that if I leave this empty, or if I don't even include it here, I'm pretty sure that's optional, right? Yep, no errors. If I leave that off, it'll default to that storage account that was created when we created this function. So specifically what that means is we go back to here, and I said all this stuff was auto-generated. Well, this is the storage account for this functions app. So by default, it'll just look here. So if I'm still correct, we'll find out in a minute, but it'll default to this container. I told it to look in this folder, and anytime something's added, it'll run our function. So in this case, what it's doing is just printing out to the log that we found a blob with this name and a certain length. And what's also cool is these triggers will give you the information you need. So like it passes in the blob. So if I knew that this was an image, like maybe we said only trigger on PNG files. Well, now I can do things for this image like create thumbnails or scale the resolution so it looks better on my website. All sorts of crazy things you can do with blob triggers. So let's ship this.
Hey,
let's
by the way, while you're summoning the ship it squirrel, blob is binary large object.
The last B is just part of object.
It's ob. Ob for object.
Yeah, that's better than just a blah trigger. All right, so it's pushing all my files to the cloud, and let's see what happens. Let's see. We want to do a couple things here. I want to have Edge, not private. I don't need private mode anymore. So let's run these side by side because I want to be able to see the logs in real time, and I want to be able to upload my file at the same time. So that's my functions. And
you might have to make those screens just a little smaller to see everything.
Which
horizontal? Actually, that looks okay. Depending on what else you're gonna be doing. We're probably good.
Famous last words.
Yeah, I know, right?
It's
hard to manage this real estate. Screen real estate.
And we want to monitor the logs. And it's the blades that are getting me. Yeah, okay. Let's see. We're getting there's our logs. I always think that the logs would be under monitor, but code and test.
Yeah,
that makes more sense, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Monitoring is part of that, but yeah, and code and test is part of monitoring, but
naming's hard. All right, so let's make another file just so we have a different file name.
Okay.
We'll go crazy and call it file 2.
Oh wow.
And let's celebrate a little early and just say it worked. All right, so if we did everything correctly, when I click upload, I will select file 2.
Mm-hmm.
And fingers crossed,
Upload that in there.
we should see our
Function should wake up.
blob trigger. There it is.
Boom.
Hey. So yeah, we see blob trigger. So again, we'll walk through this just like last time. So again, every time a function runs, you'll see the words executing and the name of it. Every time it finishes, we see executed. But our code was just to log the output. So it says C# blob trigger function processed, blob name file2.txt. Awesome. And the size was 10 bytes, which I guess sounds about right for one line of text in a text file. But how cool is that, man?
Yeah, that's awesome.
We didn't have to do anything. And
and honestly, look at the duration isn't too bad either.
Yeah. Well, the cool thing with these we'll say other triggers, because when I think of serverless, there's the HTTP trigger, which is definitely going to be the most common because that's your API, and I don't want to say every app, but probably just about every app today uses an API, and so those are probably your most common ones. But all the other ones, like these blob triggers, I think we'll have time to check out queue triggers.
Okay. We've
These
got
are
about
all
10 minutes left on the timer today before we start wrapping things up.
Speed round. Well, but what's cool about these are kind of I would say secret or different. What's the word I'm looking for? They're not directly related to a user interaction. So these are kind of, I think of these as like behind the scenes stuff that runs.
Yeah, autonomous.
Yeah, like when a user does something. So for example, I mentioned photos earlier. I love to use blob triggers because when anybody takes a picture nowadays, smartphone cameras have gotten so powerful that you have this 12 megapixel camera that file is huge. Yeah. And if you have a app that allows users to take a photo and upload it to the cloud where they can maybe share it with their friends or post on it, comment on it, like on it, whatever. Well, I don't necessarily need all 12 megapixels because I'm just going to be displaying in a mobile app that only has a specific resolution. So one great thing to do with these storage containers, the blob triggers, is when a user uploads a photo, allow them to upload the full high resolution photo, but then once it hits our storage container, we'll have a blob trigger run that resizes it so that it fits our app, and then also we'll lower the resolution. And what's kind of cool is if you ever go to Instagram and if you're in your browser, you say right click, inspect source or view the source code for Instagram.
Yeah.
You're going to see a lot of code, but if you search for the file for the image, you'll see that Instagram has I think 4 different resolutions for every image. So every time I post a photo to Instagram, they have a similar mechanism behind the scenes that resizes that photo. And depending on whether I'm in my browser, whether maybe, it's also a responsive website. So if I shrink down my browser window or if I'm in the app, it'll pick the best photo for that resolution. And so you'll always see a nice high quality picture, but they don't have to transmit 12 megabytes or a 12 megapixel photo over the wire because those things are big, they're expensive, the storage costs are expensive, the transmission costs are expensive. So these are perfect use cases for those scenarios where let people upload their photos, but I'm not paying for all 12 megapixels.
Yeah. Awesome. That's a cool use case. Yeah.
All right, so let's see if we can do a queue trigger. Speed round. We got 10 minutes.
Yeah, we've got a little less than 10 minutes before we'll get cut off. So maybe
wrap it up.
Like a 7-minute one, and we can say goodbye to everybody.
All right, so a queue trigger. What is a queue? Speed round. Well, in this storage account, we don't just have folders, we also have queues. I'll go back one level. Too far. There we go. So the storage account has containers. We can also do file shares if you want to have like a network file storage. You have tables, but we're going to be looking at these queues. A queue is exactly what it sounds like. If I add something to the queue, I can have a function listening to pick that up, and then that can trigger this function running. So think of things like this blob trigger will handle the file, and then maybe it has to save that or save something. Oh, here we go. So we've created these new scaled down images, and we want to add the URLs for those images to our database. Well, we could have this blob trigger output to a queue. So let's see. And what do you need? Oh no, I don't think I have enough time to do all this. Well, we'll run through this at a high level. So the queue trigger will look for a certain queue name.
Okay.
And anything that's added to this queue will wake up this queue trigger, and we can run code to handle it. And so I use this in my app where I need to chain together microservices. So we talked at the beginning of the show about, think of all this serverless stuff as microservices. It does one thing. So this blob trigger, well, we just output to a log, but the blob trigger could ingest the photo, create different resolutions, and then it could put those new photos onto the queue. Mm-hmm. So we could put anything onto the queue because it's all just it just serializes down to JSON. So you can put a photo, you can put a text file, you can put objects onto the queue, and then we can have something listening, and when it sees a new photo added to the photo queue, for example, it'll grab that photo off the queue, and we can write some code to maybe process it or add the URL to that photo to our database, whatever we want to do. But it's almost, I think of queues as a way to hand off information between my microservices.
And I would say also queues, aren't they, correct me if I'm wrong, they're just, it's a good insurance policy to connection loss and just making sure you didn't lose data.
Oh yeah, that's another cool thing with queues. They will automatically retry. They will the queue storage can have things queued up indefinitely, and so these queue triggers are nice because they can trigger and pick it off the queue as soon as it's on there. But maybe you don't need that level of or that speed of automation. But yeah, queues are great. You can just queue things up that you want to happen later, or if you want to hand off files or anything between projects, you can do that. So yeah, we've only got 6 minutes left, but on a high level, and maybe we do another one. I'd love to come back. So if Jason, if you have me back, we could do another episode on, because there's queue triggers, there's database triggers. We could show them all the triggers. But what I wanted to queue up was not only do functions have triggers, they also have outputs. And so if I wanted to output something to a blob, I can also save to that blob storage. So I could have a blob output, or I can have, in this case, I was going to do a queue output. So this blob trigger would do what it needs to do, then output to the queue. And so, yeah, we'll queue this up. We'll do this next time on the next show, but we'll have this blob trigger save something to the queue, and then this queue trigger will pick it up. And what's also great about this is the template does everything with strings, but like if I don't think I have any objects in this model, but it pass in anything. So like if this was a datetime object, it can automatically pass it as a datetime object and serialize and deserialize it for us. So there's a lot of cool advantages that we can get, so we don't have to worry about doing any of that in our code. But yeah, I think the best way to think of these is chaining together your microservice. So you have the microservice that runs to create thumbnails and optimize your photos. Those photos go on a queue, and then a queue trigger will pick them up and save that metadata to your database. So something like that where you want to hand off to the next microservice, kind of keep those separations of concerns separated, then queue triggers are amazing. So we'll say tune in next time as we dig deeper in serverless.
Well, unless you got anything else you want to show from your screen, I'll just bring us back to side-by-side so we can get...
oh, yeah. Let's see if my camera works again.
Get your camera working again. It's been frozen this whole show. Hey, well, look at that.
Did it work? That was easy.
It's back. I didn't even do nothing. It's just been that kind of a week.
Woo. Didn't see me sweating.
No, you had some weird like flex the whole time. You were just
really?
holding your arm. Yeah, I think you were adjusting your hat or something, or your headphones.
That's going to be great.
Well, Brandon, this has been great. We got just a few minutes left. Thank you to everybody. Hey, there's Frank in the chat. Hello, Frank, and hello to everybody, and thanks for all of you joining us. We do have one here question that just popped in about pricing. Yeah. Let's see. If I read from Blob in my function and I pass that to an app service, all in the same data center, and then do some magic in the web service and transfer that out, is there a read cost incurred?
Yeah, I mean, so the easiest way to think about pricing in Azure in general is just you pay for what you use. And so anything from like the hard drive space to store that, what was it, a 10-byte text file, that'll go on the bill. Moving data, so moving bits, reading in and out of anything, whether it's an API or containers or queues. But I mean, the cost for like what we were doing today, almost nothing. But probably the biggest part of that bill would be your app service that's just running 24/7. But yeah, in general, you pay for what you consume in Azure or what you've reserved in Azure.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the consumption-based model. You pay for what you use. Storage in general is pretty cheap, I would say, especially for, if you're just throwing things in blob storage. But yeah, there's always a transaction of something happening. But I think that's, it's so small and negligible for early projects and early development and, building out MVPs and that kind of stuff. It's not until you get it into like a production environment where you're talking about a lot of files, maybe a lot of large files, that you have to really start, looking at that stuff. And then, you have the monitoring in place and log that stuff out to keep an eye on what's happening.
And there's free tiers for just about everything in Azure. And so you can always make sure you're on the free tier. We were doing all day today, we're doing serverless functions. And we were on our consumption tier, so we only pay for what we use. But that consumption tier also comes with a bunch of free, I'll say, bits. So I forget the exact amount. It's something like, is it 1 million or 10 million CPU cycles you get for free with Azure Functions? There's some insanely large number.
Yeah, it's a really high number.
Until you even cross that threshold, you don't even... Yeah. Like Azure Functions won't even show up on your bill.
Yeah.
So
like 1 million.
So yeah.
Million, yep.
Million operations.
Yeah, something like that. Okay, well, we got just a few seconds here. Thank you, Brandon, for joining us. Thank you, everybody else, for joining us as well. It's been an awesome group. Lots of good questions. We'll be uploading today's episode to YouTube. Also, check out blog.allaroundazure.com to stay tuned with all the future episodes. But also you can go back and watch the old one that we had with Brandon back in July, and every other episode that we've done. We're up to about 40 or so that we've recorded at this point, and going to keep on going. So yeah, all right, Brandon, well, you stay safe out there. I know there's a lot of fires going on in your neighborhood, and thinking about you. Hopefully nothing bad happens, and we will see you soon.
Appreciate it. Thanks again, Jason.